Thank you for three amazing talks that I think beautifully illustrate a huge range of Tom's amazing research. I'm Frances Gardner from the University of Oxford. I was honoured and completely daunted to be asked to be discussant on this symposium. So I'll attempt a little bit of rounding up of these talks. And I think that Tom would be absolutely thrilled and, of course, above all, full of really interesting, thoughtful questions that we hadn't thought of and that really took our thinking further if he was here. So I think these papers reflect the very best of his work, the theoretical elegance, the testing of competing hypotheses, not shying away from the complexity in all these phenomena, doing this work with imagination, very careful attention in all the papers to linking the macro and the micro that characterized his work so nicely. So I just wanted to, in pulling these together, to sketch out a little sense of his contributions overall, which will then make it completely clear, if it wasn't already, how these papers draw on all these incredible qualities of Tom's work. On a personal level, I have one causal factor to account for me meeting Tom and then collaborating with him, and that is wonderful conferences like this, SPR and actually ISACAP. I have to thank them too, because thanks to those meetings, I met Tom several times in the 1990s, and my collaboration began with him due to us, for the best reason really, which was due to us all being in a bar in Barcelona in 1999, so just 20 years ago, and it was Danny Shaw and Tom and I, and that's where the ideas started to be thrown around in a very Tom kind of way that led to a collaboration over the next 2 decades on taking the family checkup to small children and doing a longitudinal intervention study there. So I'm really grateful to what conferences can do for meeting people that you otherwise would never have met. So that was quite amazing. But the experience of then working with Tom for all that time and talking to him often weekly on our meetings, and then talking to him for days on end at our annual retreats, meant incredible exposure to his very, very creative thinking about all these areas of our research interests. So Tom's brilliance. Three main topic areas, depending on how we divide them up, but of course he never kept them separate. They were always linked. So adolescent peer processes, contagion, deviancy training, and relationships. And then family process, coercion, monitoring, and other aspects of the relationship. And then parenting interventions, first for adolescents, and then applying himself to young children as well. But these were always linked by the cross-cutting themes and methods that were so characteristic of Tom's work. And as soon as we start talking about dynamics of family process and microsocial analysis, then we all have a total debt, I think, to Jerry Patterson, where Tom was kind of brought up in that stable and spent the great majority of his career. So Tom always kept sight of the importance of the minute-to-minute and the day-to-day interactions. And I think for those of us working in interventions, those are so important, because I think, as Greg said, how are you going to tell a parent what to do if you don't understand the dynamic interplay between the parent and the child? And understanding those things means that you have to use, at least some of the time, direct observations or some kind of immediate detailed diary methods, which were really nicely explained by Greg. And then there's the very characteristic linking together of systems, as Erica explained, linking the micro process with the macro development over time. And then a very important thing, I think, that Tom always did was to think outside the usual box, and bringing in ideas, for instance, from dynamic systems and evolutionary theory. He would always use theory to develop intervention, but arguably everybody does that. But I think he was one of the first to test how interventions, to use methods whereby interventions could be seen as experiments to test theories as well. And on a kind of personal intellectual level, was incredible the way he would be able to kind of join up the dots, whether it's between systems or between theories, always paying, I think perhaps more than anyone I've ever worked with, his contribution in terms of methods and theories and clinical insights and the ways those were linked together, I think is just, I've never seen anything quite like that. So although this is a symposium about his theoretical contributions, and there was another one this morning about his intervention contributions, and you have to divide up conferences artificially, but he would never make that kind of distinction, and there was the constant interplay between those different elements that led to such insights. And I think perhaps in some ways the most influential example for the whole world about beyond our field anyway, that his creative theoretical and clinical insights and how they change the way we think about prevention, I think is his work on harm. So the paper on when interventions harm has had a huge influence on a lot of fields of policy and practice beyond our kind of youth prevention field and on into criminology and many other areas. And it's one of his most his most highly cited work that he's led anyway. And it's a kind of testament, I think, to his openness that he was that he published work about harms, but then that it went on creatively again to try and elucidate the mechanisms of harm through deviancy training. And I think that's an important lesson to learn from intervention findings, whatever their direction, even if they're not what you want to find. And this has been incredibly inspiring to others, to new investigation. And these three papers illustrate, I think, all of these areas very elegantly. I'll just say a few. Have I got 5 minutes? Right. Okay. A few words about some of these questions, some of the papers. Erica's talk, I think, is novel in many ways, but taking the dynamic systems work further, which was particularly dear to Tom's heart, and really came out of his breadth of reading and thinking across areas that the rest of us perhaps hadn't thought about, and bringing those to link up with our other methods of doing things. So the idea of bringing parent self-regulation into the model, I think, is very helpful, and showing how these minute-by-minute processes influence children's development over time. I very much like the discussion, which is taken further in Erica's paper on this, about whether you could see it as a kind of conundrum that some key processes in development seem to act like two sides of a coin, and we're not sure under what conditions they are good things or not. And in this case, it was parents who are very variable in their responses to the child. Is that something good that we call flexibility, or is it just that they're inconsistent? And I think there's evidence that both ways may be important, consistency and flexibility, but how are we going to reconcile those? And I think Erica's work is starting to show ways to do that. I had some questions about measurement. I wondered how much our understanding is limited by the need in dynamic systems approaches to collapse child and parent behaviors into just a very small number of categories. But then it might be hard to actually tell to what extent parents are being flexible or whether their repertoire is very rigid or not, because that kind of variation in the way they interact with their child might be masked by the by the codes that can be allowed or possible in dynamic systems approaches. Greg, right. Greg Fosco's talk, I think, brings another of the two sides of the coin issue in. Sorry, this slide's rather busy, but to remind me what to talk about. I really like the competing hypotheses. And again, it's perhaps two sides of the same coin developmental process when we're thinking about fragility versus responsiveness. Because in a way, I mean, humans are meant to be inherently responsive to social interactions, so why would we call that fragility as if it was a bad thing? But on the other hand, we need some sense of resilience in the face of the constantly shifting reactions of others. And I suppose this puzzle is reflected also in behavioral versus attachment models of parent-child processes, which I think would also lead to quite different predictions about the implications of children's responsiveness to parents' variability. And I guess your competing hypotheses came down perhaps more in a kind of a sort of attachment sort of way, and that what was important was the connectedness was strong, and that would somehow buffer children against the variability in parents' responsiveness. And then finally, Marie-Helene's work on peer theories. This is right at the core of Tom's work, peer contagion and deviancy training. She develops new, briefer measures of deviancy training, and this is very much something dear to Tom's heart, the development of, do we need such complex measures? Will a shorter one do the same thing? And how can we be really sure that the shorter one is valid? So that's a big question, I suppose, whenever we attempt that sort of measurement development. And I think the other really interesting thing for fields way beyond our own is working out under what conditions peer contagion will help or hinder intervention processes. Because it seems likely to me that in many interventions that the mean effects that we see are going to be hiding a whole range of both positive and negative intervention effects that are going to vary across components, across peer groups and individuals, so that harmful processes, which luckily in a way, for our understanding, harmful processes that did show up in Tom's trial, otherwise we wouldn't know about it, but maybe they're going on in every intervention, and the harmful ones are working to stifle intervention change, whereas the other ones are the positive processes are doing the opposite. So how can we understand more about how we can reduce those negative effects of interventions, even when we don't see a negative main effect, but perhaps just a diminished one? Okay, so just to wrap up, just a few reflections on working with Tom. His empathy and his clinical insights with young children and their families were absolutely striking. Here was someone who'd made his career thinking about teenagers, and then he started working on our big research project about extremely young children, and he still had this incredible level of insight to what happens in families at a very different developmental stage. The family checkup was creative, based on a brilliant idea that a very brief parenting intervention could be effective by focusing in on the things that mattered most to parents and that would most motivate them to change. And the idea of a kind of co-production between parent and therapist of an assessment of the family's needs and incorporating motivational interviewing methods to stimulate realistic change in the family, I think is just a brilliant insight. And then the harm work, which has had an effect on so many fields, but I think its impact could go further still. Like, for instance, I'm not sure if the idea of peer deviancy training has reached the sexual health field yet, including the HIV prevention programs, because all over the world we aggregate youth together to learn and talk sensibly about sex and relationships. But this, to me, is the perfect arena for peer deviant talk. So do we know if there are subtle peer influences that are working to undermine the potentially positive effects of sexual health programs, or to help explain the weak and null effects that are found all over the world in many HIV prevention trials? So that's just to leave you with some thoughts about where his work could go further, but we're seeing the really detailed, important work from the speakers, and I hope you've got questions. I'm just leaving with some pictures of Oregon, because, with apologies to Arizona State, but I've only really known Tom in Oregon, and that was, I guess, his home, but also he shared his love of the Oregon countryside with Jerry Patterson, as well as so many other things. Thank you.